Tá fáilte romh go léir. Welcome everyone to our public lecture series being live streamed to you from Carlow College St. Patrick's, a third level college in Carlow town. In this series, we have been examining topics of relevance to the Leaving Certificate curriculum. Today, we are looking at history. My name is Dr. Thomas McGrath, and I'm glad that you, our biggest audience to date, are able to join us for a conversation with Holocaust survivor Tomi Reichental. Here in Carlow College, on the BA and BA Honours in Arts and Humanities, and the BA Honours in English and History, I teach courses on the history of anti-Semitism before 1933 and on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So it is a great privilege to be joined today by Holocaust survivor Tomi Reichental, who was in the Nazi concentration camp Bergen Belsen, and to be able to interview him on your behalf. I will be putting questions to Tomi. If we have time at the end, we can put some questions from the audience to Tomi. So if you have questions, put them into the Q&A on Zoom, and we will select some to put to him. In schools and colleges up and down the country, Tomi Reichental has devoted the last 20 years of his life to spreading awareness of the Holocaust, the Nazi murder of 6 million Jews. And we are delighted that he is able to join us today to speak on this subject a few days before the annual International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is on the 27th of January. Welcome to you, Tomi.
Good morning.
Yes. So, Tomi, you were born in 1935 in Czechoslovakia in Central Europe. In your book, I Was a Boy in Belsen, you paint an idyllic picture of growing up in your home village in the second half of the 1930s. Could I begin by asking you, do you remember much of that early childhood?
Yeah, I remember very well, not only because from the memory, but the fact that I wrote the book, you sort of go through a process of reminding you of the past. And because you writing your biography, you remember more because you follow as you were growing up. I would say that from the age of 4, I have memories already, but really a strong memory about the thing I did in the village. It was a small village in Slovakia called Merašice. It had about 700 inhabitants. My father was a farmer. My grandfather had the village shop. So everybody knew everybody else, and we were quite liked in the village. And of course, because of my grandfather, if there was any event, whether it was a funeral or wedding, always my father or grandfather would be invited to the event, and my grandfather would always ask about the families, how they're doing. If somebody was ill or something, he would follow it up. And as a child, I used to play with the local children. They used to come to our farm, and we used to chase and play together. At the time, I had an idyllic life like any child in a village. You feel much more free. In the summer, we used to run barefoot around, and in the winter, at the time, it used to snow already from November up to about March. Today, there is no snow anymore there. But at the time, I remember sometime we were completely isolated because you couldn't leave the village and nobody could come in. The snow was 3 feet high. But with the change of the weather and everything today, there is no longer snow. So I have very fond memory. I always say it was my paradise. It really was. We had a beautiful life, and the families used to come to visit us, my cousin and aunt and uncle, because in the village, even when the war started in 1939, we always had more than the people in the town. Among ourselves, we exchange products like somebody had chicken and somebody had other things, sugar and things. So at the time, of course, of the war, you couldn't get these things in town, but we had it. So basically, I can say my memory are very fond memory. As a child, I never knew of anti-Semitism or persecution.
When did you realize then, as a young boy, that things were changing?
I have a very, very vivid memory when I realized. First of all, my parents, they never told me anything what's going on, simply because they didn't want to frighten me. There was no point explaining about Jews and non-Jews, because as a 5-year-old, 4 or 5-year-old, or even 6-year-old, at the time, we were much more innocent. The children today, we didn't know much at all. Today, if you ask a 6, 7-year-old, they can tell you the news from all over the world. I didn't know anything beyond the village. So the parents kept that if there was any trouble and thing, and I only remember that they used to speak among themselves in Hungarian or other language, German, so that we didn't understand what they are saying. But the first time physically I experienced it was in 1941, when I was thrown out of the national school in the village because we had laws that come out, the Jewish Codex in Slovakia, that said that Jewish children can't go to a national school. And I was thrown out, and I had to go to a small town not far from where we lived, called Nitra, where there was a large Jewish population. Large, when I say large, there were about 5,000 people lived, Jewish people lived in this town. So there was several Jewish school, and I had to go there. And whereas in the village, they didn't have police or anything. The Jewish people from the Jewish Codex were instructed to wear yellow star from the age of 5. But in the village, I never wore the yellow star. I never knew about the yellow star because there was no police and there was nobody to enforce the law. But in the town, the Jewish people lived in certain part of the town. So if you come out without a yellow star, you would be arrested and fined very severely. So I remember the evening before I was going to the school for the first time, I saw my aunt was sewing the yellow star on my coat. And I asked her, what is that for? And she said, it's nothing. We are Jewish and we had to bear a yellow star. I didn't even question why and what. I just said, that's all right. I didn't care. But of course, that recognized me marked me as a Jew. And when I was going to school and children stood sort of on corner of the street, and suddenly they started to shout at me, you dirty Jew, you smelly Jew, go to Palestine, and all kind of insult that I can't even mention. That was the first time that I really realized that I'm different to the other children. And I come home from school again, the same thing used to happen. And as the time went on, these children were more aggressive. They would try to spit at me and throw a stone after me. So that was the first time I experienced, realized that I'm different to other children.
So those other children were being influenced by the current of anti-Semitism, by which we mean prejudice against the Jews, which was rising sharply in Czechoslovakia at that time.
That's right.
You then, as that happened, your family had to go into more or less hiding. How did you manage that?
Well, from the beginning, when the deportation started, which was in March 1942, I was 7 at the time. And at the time, because my father was a farmer, we got a sort of exemption paper that from the beginning we shouldn't be deported, because as a farmer, he was useful to the Slovak economy. Unfortunately, my relatives that were doctors and small shopkeepers, they were slowly taken away at the time. And we only heard they were picked up. Unfortunately, we never saw them again. This was in 1942, and I remember even my grandfather, first of all, his shop was closed because the Jews were not allowed to have their own businesses. And one day, it was in July 1942, they came and they took my grandparents away. And at the time, I remember very well when we said goodbye, and when all this is over, we will be reunited and everything will be all right. But unfortunately, we never saw them again, because from the beginning, we didn't even know what happened to them when they were taken away. But later, of course, the news leaked, and we found out that unfortunately it was a great tragedy to the Slovak Jewry, and many lost their life. And so at this time, we actually didn't hide, but we would sort of switch off the light very early in the evening, close the door, and if somebody knocked on the door, we would pretend that nobody is in the house, just in case somebody is trying to do something to us. I must say that the local people were still quite friendly, but it was actually from our side that we sort of cut contact with the outside world, with the people that I'm talking now about my parents, father and thing. We just didn't want to get the other people into trouble. There are other people would say, oh, that or that other is a Jew lover or something like this. So we didn't want to do trouble for them. So we kept back. But the people we found out after war as well in the village were very good people. There was a family that was hiding from 1942 till the liberation 1945. And everybody in the village knew about them. They stayed in a farm in the village and nobody betrayed them. So the people in the village were good. But in 1944, that's when the danger to us began because Slovakia was occupied by Germany and all these exemption paper and everything like this had no value and we would have been arrested if we didn't hide. So we hid in, actually, it was my father stayed in the village, but my mother and brother and myself, we went to Bratislava because we were afraid that we will be betrayed in the village. In the end, my father was.
You were captured by the Gestapo, the German secret police, in Bratislava. Yes. How did that come about, Tomi?
Well, we were actually on the way out of Bratislava to go to a small village somewhere where nobody knew us, and we would pretend that we were Gentiles. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, was coming with us as well. And somebody betrayed my grandmother. And when my mother came to collect her, I remember at the time she put us in a photographic shop. These were people that were friendly to my aunt that lived in Bratislava. And my mother said, you stay here. I'm going to pick up my mother and we will go to the train station and we will go to this place that nobody knew us and we had false paper. And so we waited for my mother. But when my mother came to the shop where my grandmother was waiting, as I mentioned, my grandmother was betrayed by somebody, and there was police and the Gestapo in the shop, and they established very quickly that my mother was the daughter of my grandmother, Rosalia Shaimovich. And so she was arrested. And when they brought the cases from the station and opened them, they found children's clothes, and they told my mother, where are you children? And my mother knew that if she doesn't tell them, she will be beaten and tortured, and in the end she will have to tell them. So the next thing, we're sitting in the shop and these two Gestapo men entered. They come to my brother and said, you are Jewish? And my brother said, no, I'm not Jewish. We had a new name, new paper, which had a sort of Slovak, typical Slovak name. Vida, like here, would be Murphy O'Connor. It's a typical Irish name. So we said our name is Miklos Vida and Thomas Vida. Well, first they beat my brother up, but he still didn't tell them. And then they picked on me and they beat me up. When my brother saw it, he said to the Gestapo man, please stop beating my brother, because my brother is 4 years older than me, so he was already a 13-year-old. I was only 9. I was crying, I was hurting, and uh, he admitted we are Jews. And so we were caught in Bratislava, all of us. There were actually 13 of us that were arrested on that day in Bratislava, because the Gestapo knew how to get information. My grandmother was an old lady. She was 76-year-old, and at the time, 76 was very old age. Not today, we still think we are young at that age. And they asked her who is looking after you, and she had to tell him she was beaten up. She was all bruised in the face and body, and because they got it out. And as I said, 13 of us were from the family arrested on that day.
So ultimately, Tomi, as a result of that, you and your family members were packed onto a train which might have gone to Auschwitz, but instead ended up in Bergen Belsen near the city of Hanover in northern Germany. How long did the train journey take, and what was it like on that train?
Well, I sometimes say the worst moment that I remember of the happening to me at the time was the moment when we boarded the cattle cart. Because 1 minute here we were free, still, and fed and dressed. And the moment the door on the cattle cart closed behind us, we began to be treated like animals. And we really did spend 7 days in the cattle cart traveling from Seret, which was a detention camp in Slovakia, up to Bergen Belsen. So, subsequently, I did find out how we ended up in Bergen Belsen, because the usual transport from Slovakia went from Slovakia to Auschwitz. And we went through a selection still on Slovak territory. And in this selection, they split us. The younger people, the men, were separated from the mothers and the children and the old people. And at the time, we knew what that meant. It meant that the people that were selected on one side, the men and the younger people, everybody's for war, had a chance to survive because they went to work as slave labor. But us, we were 13 of us, were split. 7 went on the right side, which were the man and the young woman, and 6 of us to the left side, which was my aunt, my cousin, my mother, my grandmother, my brother, myself, to the left. And that was definitely this time for Auschwitz to go to the gas chamber. And that was the process. But as I mentioned, I found out what happened when we were traveling. And we were traveling 7 days. It was most horrific. There was no privacy. The stench was overwhelming. Very little food and water. So there was no hygiene. We couldn't wash ourselves or anything. And everything was done in public. Like we were there about 50 people, and a cattle cart is not very big. In the middle, there was an open barrel which was used as a toilet, and like everybody saw everybody else, so it was just horrific. And as it happened, on the 7th of November, the gas chamber in Auschwitz were blown up by the German army because they were already packing to retreat because the Russians were advancing to the east. And so we were diverted in middle of the trip, not to go to Auschwitz, but towards Berlin and Buchenwald. The man and the woman were taken off the train at the time that which we were separated. So they went to Buchenwald, and we continue to Bergen Belsen. And that was our luck, if anything I can sort of mention, because if we were arrested a couple of days before, I wouldn't be here today. So it's just a fact that this happened in Auschwitz. There were no gas chamber anymore, so they didn't take us. We traveled 7 days, and it was on the 9th of November. We started on the 2nd of November, and on the 9th of November, we arrived to Bergen Belsen.
Your father was sent to Auschwitz, but escaped from the train.
Yeah.
Coming back to Bergen Belsen, what was your first experience of the camp when you got off this cattle car?
Well, it was just horrific. First of all, we arrived there in the middle of the night. It was cold, and it was November, northern Germany. We didn't know where we were. We only found out later on. But it was raining, it was cold. In November in Germany, the temperature drops very low at the time, and we had to march about 2 hours. I remember at the time we were very frightened that my grandmother will not survive this march, which was very harsh. We didn't go on the street. We went through a forest, so the ground was soggy and difficult to walk, and the soldier on each side of us had weapons and shouting, "Schnell, schnell," quickly. And I mean, my grandmother, it was very difficult for her, but eventually arrived. We had a couple of hours sleep for the first time on a bed. But in the morning, what we saw was just hell on earth. This is the only way I can describe it, because we saw these people, if you can call them people, they were skeletons and starved people moving very slowly. They were all sick, no strength. And sometimes, as the days were going on, we saw some of them falling down, never to get up again. As children, we used to play, and suddenly we would see this woman, because we were in the women camp, and she would fall down. She was just too weak to walk. And we would stop playing to watch what will happen next, because we knew one thing: if she is not getting up, that's the end of it. If she got up we knew she has another day to live, and most of the time they never got up. So we actually saw people dying in front of our eyes. It was a horrific experience.
And in the middle of that experience, Tomi, your own grandmother died.
Well, sadly, this was already quite towards the end. In fact, my grandmother died on the 7th of March, 1945, which we were liberated in April. So it was just a month before our liberation. And she died. She just gave up, and as we said, she dried up. She didn't drink enough, and of course, we were starving there, the terrible starvation. So she was murdered by starvation, and unfortunately, the experience seeing my grandmother being picked up from our room by her leg and hand, and just thrown like a piece of dirt on a pile of corpses outside front of our barracks. This is something I will never forget. I carried this horrific experience, seeing my grandmother treated this way as a child was a terrible thing, of course.
Yes, I can. It must certainly have been, and that was daily life in Bergen Belsen. It was being surrounded by bodies of the dead piling up outside the barracks.
Yeah, that was towards the end. In the first months, people were dying, but in smaller number, maybe 50, 60 a day. There was Bergen Belsen was not an extermination camp. We didn't have a gas chamber. There was no mass execution or anything like this, or experiments like people always asking. It was a detention camp, but at the same time, the system was such that people couldn't survive the regime of starvation and cold and disease, especially typhus, which is a contagious illness. And when they evacuated Auschwitz, many of the inmates from Auschwitz camp, Bergen Belsen, it's estimated over 35,000. So the population Bergen Belsen grew from 25,000 to over 60,000. That's when the tragedy of Bergen Belsen happened. It was sort of January, February, March, and finally April, that epidemic of typhus broke out in Bergen Belsen, and every day hundreds were dying. We had a crematoria in Bergen Belsen, and the crematoria was there for one purpose, to burn the corpses. So from the beginning, they managed that because, as I said, it was 50, 60 corpses a day. But of course, when hundreds began to die, 1,000 a month, it was estimated about 17,000 per month were dying. Of course, the crematoria, they did not have the capacity to burn these corpses. That when it happened, that we were all surrounded by corpses all around, because that was the way every morning we had the Sonderkommando, the special commando. These were men from the main part of the camp. They would come with trolleys on two wheels, and they would go to every barrack, and if they saw anybody die, they would take the corpse out and throw it outside. And because the crematoria couldn't cope with it. And as children, we actually played among these corpses. I mean, it's something that you can't describe. The stench of decomposing bodies and rotting bodies outside was unbearable. But we got used to that as well eventually. But we actually played among these corpses, chasing each other.
The 14-year-old Anne Frank, author of the subsequently famous diary, was in Bergen Belsen at the same time as you, and her barracks was next to yours in Bergen Belsen, and she died in Bergen Belsen. Had she survived, she would be 92 years old today, so she should still be with us. Was your barracks completely cut off from hers? And is it possible, do you think, that you would have seen her without knowing who she was?
Well, absolutely. This is the first time that somebody mentioned that. Yeah, it could have happened. I don't know. But of course, at the time, we wouldn't know who Anna Frank was. And I only remember that they were the Dutch children. And they were treated a little bit better than anybody else because in Bergen Belsen, there was the Dutch part of the camp, and the Dutch people were sort of exchanged for for German soldiers in the Allied hands. So they were getting more food and everything. But Anna Frank, of course, died because he contracted typhus, and unfortunately it happened. Well, there is a dispute. Some say that only weeks before the liberation, some say it happened much earlier. There is not exact record.
Do you remember the camp commandant, Joseph Kramer, and the female guard, Irma, both of whom were executed after the war?
That's right. Kramer, he looked like a butcher. And we saw, I mean, every day nearly, he used to go around, and he was just somebody that found pleasure in killing people. I don't know. He used to have a little balcony on the kitchen. That kitchen was not far from us, and that inmates they were starving, so they used to go sort of near the kitchen, trying to find a skin of potato, something to eat. And he would stand there, and if somebody come nearer, he just shoot them. And we used to hear the shots being fired. And then I never saw him shooting anybody, but we used to hear the shots being fired. And then when we were on the roll call, the corpse would be left there as an example, a warning that if you're doing something that is out of order, this is what you would expect. He was a butcher, he sadist. He came from Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, he used to be the man that used to throw the cyclone into the gas chamber. I have actually a picture in Auschwitz from Kramer, where they're sort of celebrating and singing these SS people. And he's one of there, he's among among these officers. And then he came to, it was in December, he came to Bergen Belsen, became the commander of Bergen Belsen. Irma Greece, she came to Bergen Belsen in the last several weeks. I saw her, she came to visit us. We only remember her because she was so notorious that the people that come from Auschwitz, they told us about her. She used to participate in the selections, and she used to be very cruel. If somebody didn't behave themselves, she would let her Alsatian dog on the people, and she used to shoot some woman with children. She was also a sadist, and she came from a background of a nurse. She was a nurse in a hospital before she became. She was only 22-year-old, blonde. She stood out as a very beautiful woman, and we only heard. But in Bergen Belsen, she came to see us, and everybody, of course, knew who she was from the people from Auschwitz. And at the time, they were all angel of death, they used to call her. But in Bergen Belsen, again, this is only from what I heard, there was the men were separated from the women, and sometimes some of the men or the women would go to the barbed wire and trying to speak to the man on the other side. And if she caught anybody like this, she would beat them up. But again, I didn't see anything like this that she did. But she had a very very bad name.
Yes.
She was executed as well. Yeah.
Yes. On the 15th of April, 1945, you were liberated from the Nazis in Bergen Belsen. Do you remember what happened on that day?
Yeah, very well. Yeah. Well, we expected a couple of days before already that something is happening. First of all, we heard a lot of shooting, heavy guns in distance. So we knew that something is happening, there is fighting. But this shooting wasn't really exceptional, because in Bergen Belsen there was a German armored camp where they learned how to manage war with war with tanks. So we used to hear shooting all the time. But this was sort of more intensive, and it was getting louder and louder. And it was about 11th of April that suddenly we didn't see the guards in the watchtower. Already before they changed the guards from German guards, we had Hungarian guards who were like a Dutch army. They were all people. But the German were, of course, sent to the front to fight. So they had to put these Hungarian guards into the watchtower. So we knew things are happening already weeks before the liberation. We were only expecting it all the time. I mean, when the people from Auschwitz came to Bergen Belsen, they said that the German army is retreating, and that's why they took their prisoner with. And but I mean, it took 3 months before we were liberated, which was So 4 days before, suddenly there were no soldiers, and food was not delivered, water stopped coming. So we knew that something is happening. And it happened all very suddenly on the 15th of April afternoon, about 3 o'clock. We heard this rumbling coming through the camp because there was a road in the middle of the camp that separated the main camp from the women camp. And we all ran to the barbed wire to see what was happening. And we saw the soldiers, the jeeps were coming, lorries, and then the tanks were driving in. And it was a very subdued welcome because 90% of the inmates were mortally sick in Bergen Belsen. There was no shouting or dancing and things, very quiet smiles. And they filmed the entry as they were coming in. So I have a picture where my brother is on the picture. So I have actually a picture of the moment when the camp was liberated, which is a moment that we have from that time. As I say, it happened all suddenly, and the tables were torn, we were liberated, and the Germans were all arrested and became prisoners of war of the British Army.
Many thousands of starving inmates died in Bergen Belsen even after liberation. Can you explain why that happened, even though plenty of food had become available to them?
Yeah, when the British Army came in, they were overwhelmed. I mean, they didn't have enough nurses or doctors or anything to cope with it. There were 60,000 people there, mostly mortally sick. So that they realized that people were starving, were in a terrible state. And so the British Army left on sort of various places a trailer full with military portion so everybody could take whatever they wanted. They didn't realize that after such a long time of starvation, the stomach of the people wasn't able to digest this military portion because this was very nourishing food, protein and everything for the soldier to be able to fight. But the inmates couldn't digest, and they were so hungry. Beef and very good food. They just gobbled it up, and unfortunately, many died. So there is sort of a statistical estimate that because of this blunder, at least 2,000 people lost their life. So it took a couple of days, 1 or 2 days, before the British realized, and they withdrew this trailer out and started a regime of feeding the inmates in very small portion. But beside this blunder, people were still dying because they were just too far gone. They couldn't save them. And it's estimated that after liberation altogether, between 10 to 15,000 people still died. And there was also a problem. They had to bring students from London University medical schools. They brought them in to help out. And the instruction was, save the people that you can save. Don't waste your time on people that are too far gone. So these were students in the 18, 20-year-old. They had to make decisions who to save and who to leave to die, because it was just so overwhelming. They couldn't look after everybody. So even though some of them still were alive, they just had to leave them because it was too late anyway. So you can imagine what it must have been for these medical students, this burden to decide who to save and who to leave to die.
Yes, indeed. Tomi, it's clear that the Germans were intent, given the opportunity, on murdering every last Jewish person. Now, many people who survived the Holocaust attribute their survival to remarkable good luck, piled on more good luck at key moments. Would you agree to that, or was there more to it than good luck, very good luck?
It must have been more to it. It's also a strength to want to survive. Some people just gave up. For example, in Bergen Belsen, as I said, it was an extermination camp. But many people, they just couldn't bear dying. They were dying because of typhoid, starvation, cold. And if you got a typhus, it wasn't something that happened and within a week you died. There was medication, but they never gave to anybody any medication. So they lived, and they lived for weeks and months with typhus, and it was a very painful death. So some of the people just choose to end it all, and during the night they would run towards the perimeter and began to climb the barbed wire and, of course, the guards in the watchtowers, because every 300 yards there was a watchtower. With the searchlights, they would see them and they would shoot them. And that they knew this. So these people basically knew they can't escape, but they can escape the suffering by doing this and basically committing suicide. And we used to hear these shots being fired during the night. And in the morning, we would find only in our section when we lived 2 or 3 corpses. But this used to happen all around the camp. So during the night, there might have been 30, 40 people shot because they tried to escape. I mean, they didn't try to escape, but just to escape the torture that they were going through, committing suicide.
You have been back to Bergen Belsen for some of your film documentaries. Was it hard to go back there?
Yeah, I remember the first time when we went. It was we started to do the first film. I think it was in 2004 or 5, and I remember my cousin and my brother were with me as well, and we come in a bus to the camp, and then we had to walk up sort of incline, and as we come up, front of us there was a beautiful grassy area, and behind it the forest, because Bergen Belsen, in fact, was built in the middle of a forest. And this looked so peaceful, beautiful. And you could only imagine a scout camp there, and children are playing and having a good time. But at the time we were there, that grassy area was covered with thousands of corpses. So we were being filmed as we were coming up this hill, and in front of us was this grassy area, and our faces were like stone cut faces, you know. The shock of seeing this area and remembering what was there only years before was a horrific experience, not only for me, for my brother and my cousin as well. We were absolutely devastated. So it was a difficult encounter first time when we come to Bergen Belsen. But I was there about 4 or 5 times. Last year I was even invited by the authority there, but we had to cancel because of the COVID. I don't know what will happen this year, but the number of survivors of Bergen Belsen are, of course, getting smaller and smaller. So they try to invite to this event some of us, and they pay for everything, and we are treated very well. So I don't know what is going to happen today, but this year, but maybe they will have something, but they wanted to have it last year.
Tomi, 35 members of your family were murdered in the Holocaust. How have you managed not to be bitter about that?
Well, it's the whole subject of bitterness it's a very important process that a person has to get over. Because being bitter and living with this feeling of bitterness, it's a double-edged sword. It's not only that you hate him and it bothers you all the time, but you yourself suffer from it. And therefore, from the beginning, I always thought to myself, I have to look forward, not backwards, because it would. I will be the only one to suffer. The people I hating and everything, and they're doing all right, but I would suffer. So I had to sort of give up this notion of bitterness and things. But later also I started to think more and more about this whole event that happened to us and happened to the German people, of course, because in the end, you sort of think, if I was born at that time into a German family and gone through this brainwashing, what they went through, who knows what I would have done. So all this what happened, it's not black and white. There is a gray area in the middle. For example, I wanted to meet one of the guards that I discovered. She was alive. When I discovered that she years ago, she was 92. I heard that last year in December, she passed away. She was nearly 100-years old. This woman, she was accused of killing 2 people. And I knew all her history. I wanted to meet her, and everybody asking, what the hell you want to meet this horrible person? But then when you think about it, this woman, she, from the age of 12, she belonged to the Hitler Mädchen movement, where they were brainwashing her what the Jews were, and they were enemies of the Germans, and that the Jews wanted to overtake Germany and overtake the world and all this nonsense. Of course, after all these years, she was 22 when she was in Bergen Belsen. She grew up in a family. Her father was a drunkard. Her mother was working, so there was nobody to look after her. So it was it's the telephone. So she was a very primitive person, and suddenly she became this person in the camp, this power, and she behaved herself not in a nice way, and that's a sad thing. Which when I wanted to meet her, I just didn't even want to go to her past. But I just wanted to hear from her that she shows some regret or apologize what happened, because I thought after 70-odd years, surely she realized what happened was a terrible injustice. But unfortunately, she still was a denial of the Holocaust, and she didn't see anything, she didn't know anything. And every interview she had, she said all lies, and so it was regretful to find out that after all she still became a denier of the Holocaust instead. Admitting some
questions coming in, Tomi, from viewers. One of them is, if you could talk to any of the SS guards today, what would you say to them or ask them? Well, I think you've answered that just now. Another is, did your parents survive? And thankfully they did, and it was very rare for a nuclear family to survive. Father, mother.
Well, this is the greatest miracle, and that how we all were reunited. We were reunited. My father, when he jumped out of the train, he fought against the German. He became an interpreter when they caught the German, and they were trying to get information. So my father spoke perfect German, and he used to be the interpreter, and he used to carry explosives for sabotage war, and he survived, and we survived as well. We didn't know of each other up to about June 1945. This was about a month or two after liberation that we discovered that my father is alive, and my father discovered that we were alive, and that we were reunited in the end was a miracle. My aunt lost her husband, and at the time we were separated. They went to Buchenwald, and they never survived. 7 of them, only 1 out of the 7 survived. He was her son. He was 15-year-old. The rest of them also were murdered in slave labor.
Yeah. Other questions which I think, by your very presence here, you've dealt with. Was it hard to adjust to life after your liberation? I think you've answered that. Another one is, how did you end up in Ireland? Well, you've been in Ireland since 1959. I think an employment opportunity. But the question I'd like to put to you in particular is, do you think that envy and jealousy was the basis for the discrimination and hostility towards the Jewish people?
You know, it always was there and always is, and it's still today, unfortunately. It just, you know, when I finished the first film, at the end of it, I was asked, why you think it's this anti-Semitism and against the Jews, why is this thing? I said, I asking myself as well, why?
A question in from another viewer is directly related. Have you experienced anti-Semitism in Ireland?
I must say I did not, and I must say that I was everywhere received with the greatest respect. I have many friends here, and it's a debate here in Ireland. I mean, in the Jewish community, sometimes there are some slogan or things put on wars, and there was some incident in the synagogue and everything. And I am a public person. I go to schools. I spoke to over 100,000 students and everything, and nowhere I was in any way confronted with anti-Semitic remark or anything like this. So I always, I'm one of the people that testify, well, there is the media is a little bit inclined with the Israeli problem, or Palestinian-Israeli problem, which I don't get involved in because I'm just like everybody else. I'm living here, so I don't know more than anybody else knows here. But I might be asked about this occasionally.
Well, Tomi, can I ask you, as we head towards a conclusion, what do you think are the lessons of the Holocaust for today? How can we avoid something similar happening again? Or what safeguards can society put in place to manage behavior of this kind? And maybe what are the issues in contemporary society that cause you concern?
Yeah, it basically, I think the education is a very important thing. Because Holocaust is an example not only to Jewish people, but it's an example today also the racism that we experience. And there is a racism, and it starts very early in life. And the bullying, there are cases, I was told many times in some school, and the rules are very strict. The person might be a bully, and still the school can't do much about it. They can't throw them out of the school or anything. So it is a problem. What can we do? First of all, we shouldn't become bystander. That's one very important thing. If any of us see somebody behaving in a racial way or anti-Semitic way, we should stand up to these people and tell them to stop, and if they don't stop, to report it to the authority. And the government should apply some rules. We had just lately a UN resolution, which is that if anybody is trying to deny the Holocaust. It's a criminal offense. I mean, it was in Germany for years. Now it is recognized in the UN. These are the steps that have to be taken because you can't deny Holocaust. I was there. It did happen, and it was horrific, the greatest crime in human history, and therefore nobody can deny this. So there are things, and education is very important.
Thank you very much, Tomi. Let me conclude by saying I think we've all learned something today from Tomi's powerful and compelling testimony. And we've been honored to have you with us, telling us about your direct experience of the Holocaust and the greatest threat to civilization in the history of humanity. And also there in your final remarks there about how you seek an open, tolerant society, a multicultural society where human rights for everyone are respected and where discrimination and exclusion are rejected, and wherein when prejudice is spotted and it is questioned the moment it begins to manifest itself. So I think, Tomi, you're calling us to live our lives on a higher level that is beyond prejudice. And that has been your story for the last number of years, ably supported by your partner Joyce. You've become a national figure in Ireland, well known in the media, on television and radio, and maker of documentary films, and the recipient of many awards, including several honorary doctorates, all well deserved, for your huge work in schools and colleges, where you've directly spoken to over 100,000 people, as you've mentioned. And I would urge all viewers today, if you haven't read Tomi's book, his best-selling book, I Was a Boy in Belsen, to do so. May I make two brief final points? The best of all luck to all Leaving Certificate students and all mature students filling out the CIO forms for the 1st of February, which is coming up. Remember that today's event came to you from Carlow College St. Patrick's, and we are offering small group college tours to students who would like to see the campus, and our recruitment team is dealing with all inquiries. And details will be emailed to you with the link to this recording. The next public lecture in this series will cover very different ground, as it takes place on Monday, the 14th of February, which of course is St. Valentine's Day. And one of our philosophy lecturers will speak on the philosophy of love. Do join us then on the 14th of February. Thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks and warm thanks on everyone's behalf to Tomi Reichental for being with us. Gora Mohagwiv Galer, Slán Gofó.
Thank you.